Lieutenant Jake Morrison's survey ship experienced catastrophic system failure while mapping the outer edge of unexplored space. Navigational malfunctions sending him wildly off course into completely uncharted territory. Then critical hull breach forcing emergency, landing on a planet that didn't appear in any Alliance database. The crash was brutal. His ship tore through thick forest canopy with terrifying force before impacting in a clearing, emergency systems barely managing to keep him alive through deceleration that should have been immediately fatal. He lost consciousness as containment fields failed, and his crashed vessel, filled with unfamiliar atmosphere, his sensors couldn't properly analyze before systems went completely offline. When Jake regained consciousness, he wasn't in his ship anymore. He was lying on something soft, woven fabric with texture nothing like ship materials, in a space that was clearly some kind of building interior, but with architectural styles he didn't recognize at all. Natural light filtered through openings that weren't quite windows in the human sense. The air smelled different, floral, slightly sweet, entirely alien in ways his confused brain struggled to process. And he was surrounded by faces staring down at him with expressions combining obvious curiosity, evident caution, and something else he couldn't quite identify. All of them were women, or at least presenting as women to his human perception, tall and slender, with long, elegant ears that immediately marked them as clearly non-human, skin tones ranging from pale silver to deep blue-violet. They wore practical clothing that suggested a pre-industrial or perhaps early industrial society. No visible technology beyond basic tools and woven materials, and they were all staring at him like he was simultaneously the most fascinating and most confusing thing they'd ever encountered. One of them, appearing younger than most of the others, with bright violet eyes and skin the color of twilight sky, leaned closer, studying his face with intense focused attention. She said something in a language Jake's translator implant didn't recognize, which was immediately concerning, because those implants were specifically designed to handle thousands of known languages through sophisticated pattern recognition algorithms. The others responded to her comment, their voices musical but completely incomprehensible without translation support. Jake tried to sit up, and immediately several of them moved toward him. Whether to help or to restrain him, he couldn't tell. Sharp pain lanced through his ribs and left arm. Definitely seriously injured in the crash, though someone had clearly provided medical care. Clean cloth bandages wrapped carefully around his torso and arm, the kind of practical field medicine that suggested these people knew what they were doing even without access to advanced technology. The young woman with violet eyes gestured for him to remain still, her meaning clear despite the language barrier. Her expression showed concern mixed with that intense curiosity. Jake forced himself to relax back against whatever he was lying on, trying to assess his situation through the pain and confusion. Crashed on unknown planet. Rescued by indigenous population with no apparent spacefaring capability. Injured but receiving care. Ship presumably destroyed or at least completely non-functional. And surrounded by what appeared to be an entirely female society who had absolutely no context for understanding what a human man was. This was going to be complicated. Over the following hours and days, Jake gradually pieced together his situation through careful observation and increasingly successful attempts at establishing basic communication. He was in a village of perhaps 300 inhabitants, all of them women, built into a forested region with architecture that blended seamlessly into the natural surroundings. They'd found his crashed ship, pulled him from the wreckage before it completely failed, brought him to their healing house, and had been caring for his injuries with herbal medicines and practical medical knowledge that was surprisingly effective. They had never seen a man before. Not a human man, any man of any species. Their society appeared to be exclusively female, reproducing through means Jake didn't yet understand, but that clearly didn't require male biological participation in any way he recognized. His presence created fascination mixed with genuine uncertainty about what exactly he was. The young woman with violet eyes, her name sounded something like Lyra, when Jake attempted to pronounce it with human vocal apparatus, became his primary contact and informal translator. She was intensely curious, asked countless questions through increasingly sophisticated gestures and determined attempts at establishing shared vocabulary, brought him various items from his ship that she'd clearly been studying carefully to try to understand their purpose. She showed him his translator implant, carefully retrieved from the crash wreckage, and through patient pantomime made him understand that she wanted to learn how it worked and whether it could be repaired. Jake, essentially immobilized by his injuries and completely dependent on these people's hospitality for survival, began teaching Lyra basic human standard language. She proved remarkably quick at pattern recognition and linguistic learning, and within several days they could communicate in simplified human standard, supplemented with gestures and careful context building. Through these gradually more complex conversations, Jake learned crucial information. This world, they called it Velmara, had absolutely no records of contact with other spacefaring species. These people, the Velthari, had lived in isolated village communities for as long as their historical memory extended, which appeared to be several thousand years based on their oral traditions. They had mythology about sky visitors and those who came from stars, but those stories were considered ancient legends, not literal historical accounts or predictions of possible future events. Males didn't exist in their species. Not anymore. They hadn't for so long that most Velthari didn't even have clear conceptual frameworks for understanding gender differences beyond very abstract mythology about those who were different in the ancient past. Lyra's fascination with Jake went far beyond simple first contact curiosity or novelty. She was a scholar within her community, someone who studied their limited historical records, asked persistent questions about things others simply accepted as natural facts about how the world worked. Jake's arrival represented concrete evidence for possibilities she'd only theorized about, that the world might be vastly larger and stranger than their isolated village existence suggested, that the old myths about sky visitors might have actual historical basis. As Jake slowly recovered over the following weeks, he and Lyra developed genuine friendship built on mutual curiosity and the peculiar intimacy that develops when two people become each other's only bridge between completely different worlds and ways of understanding reality. She taught him about Velthari biology and social organization. They reproduced through a process involving genetic material exchange between two individuals that created offspring carrying inherited traits from both parents, but it didn't require gender differentiation as humans understood it. Any two adult Velthari could reproduce together through their biological process. Males had existed in their distant evolutionary past. The old records were fragmentary but clear enough on that point. But some combination of genetic drift and environmental adaptation had caused male births to gradually cease thousands of years ago. Most contemporary Velthari had simply adapted to this as normal reality. Lyra was different from most of her people. She'd read the incomplete ancient records carefully, notice the references to those who were different, and the ones who no longer come, realized that something fundamental had changed in their species' biological and social structure. She'd wondered what had been lost, what her people didn't know about their own history. Jake represented living evidence that gender differentiation existed across species, that the fragmentary old records weren't purely mythology, that the Velthari might not always have been an exclusively female population. Jake taught her about humanity, our biological and cultural diversity, our centuries of space exploration, the thousands of different species humanity had encountered across the explored regions of the galaxy, most of whom had various forms of gender or reproductive differentiation. He described Earth and the Alliance and the vast complicated network of civilizations and cultures that existed far beyond Velmara's isolated skies. He explained human concepts of gender, the biological frameworks and the cultural constructions, the diversity of how different human societies had understood and organized around gender throughout our complex history. Lyra brought these conversations to her village council, the informal group of respected elders who made important decisions affecting their community. Jake's presence and the knowledge he represented created intense, sustained debate. Some council members wanted to keep his presence secret from other communities, worried that knowledge of the wider galaxy would fundamentally disrupt their stable traditional society in unpredictable and potentially dangerous ways. Others argued for learning everything Jake could teach them, viewing his accidental arrival as extraordinary opportunity rather than threatening disruption. Lyra argued passionately and persistently that they couldn't responsibly ignore what Jake represented, that the galaxy was demonstrably vast and complex, and that eventually other ships would inevitably find Velmara, whether their society felt ready or not. Better to learn and prepare through interaction with someone who had crashed accidentally and genuinely needed their help and cooperation than to wait passively until first contact happened on potentially less friendly terms with visitors who might not respect Velthari autonomy. Jake's ship was completely unsalvageable. The crash had destroyed critical systems far beyond what the Velthari's current technology level could possibly repair. He was effectively stranded on Velmara indefinitely, at least until another Alliance ship happened to pass through this region of space, which could easily be many years given how far off standard survey routes his malfunction had taken him. The village council, after weeks of careful deliberation, offered Jake a formal choice. He could remain and live among them as part of their community, sharing his knowledge of the wider galaxy while learning their ways and contributing to their society. They would accept him as a permanent member if he chose to stay. Or they would help him attempt to reach a more technologically advanced settlement rumored to exist in a different region of Velmara, where other Velthari communities with different developmental paths might have resources that could repair his ship's communication systems or help send signals to Alliance space requesting rescue. Lyra advocated strongly for him staying in their community, not just because of her obvious personal interest and their developing friendship, but because she genuinely believed their society would benefit enormously from sustained connection to the wider galaxy, from understanding that they were part of something vastly larger than their isolated village existence had previously suggested. Jake chose to stay, partially because the alternative involved extremely dangerous journey across completely unfamiliar terrain to reach communities that might not actually exist or be any more technologically capable of helping him. Partially because he'd formed genuine, meaningful connections with Lyra and many others in the village, who had cared for him with dedication and kindness during his extended recovery. But primarily because he recognized with absolute clarity that he represented first contact between humanity and the Velthari species, and that how this contact unfolded would matter profoundly for both species' futures and their eventual relationship with the wider galactic community. Over the following months, Jake carefully integrated into village life while deliberately maintaining his distinct identity as human and as eventual representative of the Alliance if rescue ever came. He taught practical knowledge that their society could reasonably absorb: basic astronomy and cosmology, simple technologies that their existing resource base could support, languages and conceptual frameworks from the wider galaxy that might help them navigate future contacts. He learned Velthari practical skills in return: their sophisticated forestry and sustainable agriculture techniques, their extensive medicinal knowledge based on local plants, their methods of organizing communities through consensus rather than hierarchical authority structures. And he developed increasingly close personal relationship with Lyra, who became not just his primary cultural translator and teacher, but his genuine friend and confidant, and eventually something more complex than either term could fully capture. Though what more actually meant when navigating relationship across species that didn't share gender frameworks or reproductive biology required constant, careful negotiation and extraordinarily honest communication. Years later, when an Alliance survey ship finally detected Jake's original emergency beacon signal and made formal first contact with Velmara, they found a profoundly transformed situation from what they'd expected. Jake had spent those years establishing careful first contact protocols with multiple Velthari communities, preparing their societies for meaningful interaction with the wider galaxy through gradual education and cultural exchange. He'd created practical frameworks that respected Velthari autonomy and traditional ways, while opening genuine possibilities for trade, knowledge sharing, and mutual learning. The Velthari, guided significantly by Lyra's advocacy and scholarship, had begun cautiously reaching out beyond their historically isolated communities. They were sharing knowledge and resources across their world, rebuilding connections and cultural exchanges that had been lost when their species underwent its profound biological transformation thousands of years ago. And Jake and Lyra had become recognized advocates for a specific approach to first contact situations, one that didn't impose external frameworks or rush integration, but instead allowed isolated societies to engage with the wider galaxy entirely on their own terms and timeline, maintaining their cultural identities and autonomy while genuinely expanding their possibilities and connections. When asked by Alliance officials and researchers about the crash that had brought him to Velmara, Jake told the story with complete honesty. "I woke up in the care of alien women who had never seen a man of any species, who pulled me from my destroyed ship and provided medical care despite having absolutely no cultural or biological context for understanding what I was." Lyra especially, she chose curiosity over fear, wanted to genuinely understand rather than just categorize me as strange. That fundamental curiosity and openness saved my life and created the foundation for actual first contact rather than just rescue and immediate departure. He paused. "I stayed not primarily because I was trapped by circumstances, though that was certainly a factor. I stayed because I recognized the extraordinary opportunity to conduct first contact properly. Slowly, respectfully, building genuine relationships and mutual understanding, rather than just extracting myself as quickly as possible or imposing alliance frameworks on an isolated society that had developed perfectly functional ways of organizing themselves." And Lyra's perspective, when she eventually addressed alliance representatives and xenoanthropologists studying the Velthari. "The sky visitor, Jake, crashed in our forest exactly like the ancient legends had always said would someday happen. He was severely injured, completely confused, entirely dependent on our care and goodwill for survival. Most of our people were understandably cautious or frightened by something so completely outside our normal experience. I was fascinated rather than frightened." He represented concrete proof that the world was vastly larger than our isolated village existence, that the fragmentary old records about those who were different weren't just mythology or metaphor. Her expression showed the deep respect and affection that had only grown over years. Teaching each other our languages, our worlds, our fundamentally different ways of understanding reality and organizing society, that patient mutual education became the foundation for bringing our people into meaningful engagement with the wider galaxy, not as subjects to be colonized or cultures to be preserved in amber, but as autonomous partners consciously choosing our own path of engagement and cultural exchange on terms we could accept and understand.